right, so I think we're up to chapter 2 in the Torah. Chapter 2 is the Torah of Shem in the World of the Ger book. That's page 40. So a lot of these concepts are already familiar to us, but we'll try to expound on things that are a little bit more unique. Let's see. Part 1, Primordial Torah. God created the world and gave man the Torah so he would know how to live in it. Torah means instruction, as it also means law, as in Deuteronomy, according to the law which they shall teach you, and according to the judgment which they shall tell you, you shall do. So that's referring to the Sanhedrin. I'm pretty sure that that's the familiar verses about the rebellious sage, that first it says you should follow, and then it says if someone doesn't follow so-and-so, that he should be punished. I'm pretty sure that that's the discussion there. It's interesting that he says here that the Torah was what God created the world and gave man the Torah. Well, obviously that's true, but there's one point he doesn't mention. Maybe he mentions it later on, but we know that what the Torah came before the world even, and the Midrash says metaphorically that God looked into the Torah to create the world. So it's not that God made a world and then he needed to teach people how to behave, so he made the Torah after making the world. It's actually the other way around. God, there was a Torah existed, and the world was shaped or was developed from the Torah, the other way. Okay, next paragraph. It is often said that the world was a moral and spiritual wasteland until Israel received the Torah on Mount Sinai, or at least until Abraham left his birthplace and came to the land that God showed him. But the truth is that the world was never a spiritual wasteland. Torah has always been with man, right from the beginning. Primordial Torah is known as the Torah of Shem, as we will learn, as Hashem with God's help. So yes, obviously, something that we all know, he's going over some, again, points that we know, which is that the Torah was given to man from the beginning. And that Adam knew it, Shem, obviously Noah knew it, Shem knew it. The famous Jacob learned in the study halls of Shem and Aver. So there was a constant tradition of about the Torah. So look, the point is, what is he saying this for? He's trying to obviously explain to all the nations of the world that this isn't really something unique to Israel. The Torah really belonged to all of mankind in the beginning. Then things, the thing is that so much of man didn't accept it and so on, but there was always those select who did follow it, and in a similar vein to the Bnei Noach, in a kind of voluntary way. In other words, it was part of their service, and they went above and beyond in order to serve God, in the highest possible way. And that is by following his will and all of their actions, all of their thoughts, and so on and so forth. To do that, you have to follow the Torah. You have to follow halacha in all your actions. Okay. Adam received the Torah the same day he was created, as it says, and the Lord God commanded the man, saying, of every tree of the garden you may freely eat, but of the tree of knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat from, for in the day that you eat from it, surely you shall die. So how do we see from this verse what he's saying, that he was taught the whole Torah? Let's see. The Talmud tells us that encoded within the single command are the 7 universal laws, which include prohibitions against idol worship, blasphemy, murder, theft, sexual perversion, eating the limb of a living animal, and failure to establish proper courts of law. So I guess what we're saying is, it's that not necessarily all the 613, but the 7 and all the fundamentals of Torah that are rooted in them were given to Adam and were always from the beginning with man. So that's certainly, at least that's what we're learning from the Talmud. Now I think in Shem, in terms of Shem and Aver and the study of Jacob, I think there's a lot more than only the 7 laws. But anyway, let's continue. These laws were repeated to Noah after the flood and became known as the 7 laws of the children of Noah. They were repeated again by Moses at Mount Sinai, where they became binding for all time, where the Jewish people were instructed to teach them to the nations of the world. Again, it just amazes me because, Noah, Rashi tells us that Noah was familiar with which animals were considered pure and which were impure, whether that meant for kashrut, whether that meant in terms of purity laws. Appears that certainly the simple meaning is it meant for purposes of kashrus, of what food is kosher and what isn't kosher. He was familiar, which is the language is used. God tells him he should take from the pure animals, from the clean animals, such 7, and from the impure 2. So 2 couples, two pairs, or 7 pairs. So, and Rashi comments, what's the meaning of this? So he says, you see it from here that Noah knew the Torah. And that's not one of the 7, though. The kosher animals is not one of the 7 laws. So clearly we see the meaning is that Noah knew more. Again, as we all know, because he kept the other laws of the Torah voluntarily. The basis, the obligatory was a 7, but he kept everything. So it appears. Okay. Let's see. If he didn't keep it, that would mean that he knew it without keeping it. And that wouldn't be in line with what we know about kind of what we know about Noahide law, what we know about Torah also, that it's not academic, and particularly really a Noahide is not supposed to study in that type of a form, just academically or hypothetically. So, again, you could say that certainly the written Torah can. I mean, there's a lot of exceptions. But the point is the simple implication of what we're saying, it seems that Noah, similar to Abraham, was the patriarchs, was keeping the Torah in whatever exact fashion, but he seems like he was keeping much more than the 7, for sure. Okay. So he points out something interesting in this paragraph in terms of what was unique about when the 7 were re-given at Sinai. And he says at that point, they were binding for all time. And the Jewish people were instructed to teach them. So the 2 elements there that were new. The fact that they were now going to be forever binding. Evidently, that wasn't the case for Adam and Noah. They themselves were commanded, and I guess to their children, but unclear for how long that would last, I guess. Once it was given at Sinai, it was forever. And then also the interrelationship between the Jewish people and the teaching of those laws to the nations. That took place at Sinai. So you have the parallel in which, in the same way that the 613 commandments are eternal, the laws of Noah became eternally binding at Har Sinai, at the Mount Sinai. And also the relationship between Israel and the nations was solidified through the event on Mount Sinai as well. Okay. All right, next paragraph. The Noahide laws guarantee stability, continuity, and permanence to any society that follows them. Yes, this has to do with, as we said so many times, about settling. So it's related to stability, continuity, permanence, things societies need. And they promise the individual a life blessed by God in this world, in the world to come, as it says, it is a tree of life for those who grasp it. And obviously, that Torah is going both in the Torah of the nations and on Israel. These 7 laws are the nigla of the Primordial Torah. These 7 laws are the revealed Torah and Torah law halacha of the Torah before history. The revealed teachings of God that have always been with mankind and are relevant to all people at all times. So, I mean, what that basically is saying, it's part of the very definition of a human being to keep these laws. They're an absolute, without them, in other words, they're bound up with the very basic image of God, these 7 laws. Without them, the person's image is, skewed, so to speak. The point is, it's kind of like, it's like a fish has to live in water, and we need to eat food The 7 laws are basic to being a human being. Okay. Next paragraph. There is another stream of Torah called Nistar, the Torah's mystical or hidden teachings. Adam was given these teachings as well, but he received them only after he had been driven out of the Garden of Eden. How interesting. So only after Adam left the Garden of Eden, then he was taught the mystical teachings. It's a very interesting statement because it's very similar to what's taught in Hasidic works, in that the Hasidic, in other words, the question arises, why did the Baal Shem Tov and his teachings come when they did, so late, basically, really in Jewish history? And also, why has there been a proliferation of study of the mystical part of Torah? And the answer has very intertwined with this, is that because the outside has become more darker, and the distance between man and God has become wider, and so we need kind of the extra, shot of the mystical teachings to help build a connection between man and his creator. To also, the materialism is so very strong and heavy and coarse, in these later generations, that it's the mystical teachings that help a person become more sensitive, become more spiritual, and give them a greater awareness of the spiritual, realities of the world. Before then, people were there was more of a natural sense for that. Okay.
Just briefly, if I may.
Sure. Yes.
You were saying that these 7 laws were an integral part of God when he created man. Is that correct? Is that how I understood it?
They're well, of course, everything is in part of God, but I was saying that they're integral, they're inherent, and they are a required, necessary part of man.
Exactly, because if you take that, what you just said, inherent and required of man, if man, Adam, was created in the image of Hashem, then absolutely it's inherent.
Right.
So it becomes incumbent upon us to reflect that. And if we fail in any one of these areas, it is up to us to improve that midot so that we can be that reflection. Thank you.
Okay, exactly. So in other words, it's a necessary part of the image of God to have these, to keep these 7 qualities, these 7 prohibitions, the 7 parts of these 7 values and lifestyles. But are you saying, and I think there's something to what you're saying, are you also saying, you're saying it's integral to God himself? Of course. In other words, the idea of image of God is the only reason I hesitate to say that is because seems like God kind of requires much more than that. I mean, he also requires, the philosopher said there's a necessity of God being infinite and without bounds and without any, there's the necessities go far beyond just these 7. So it seems like that they are necessary for the image, though, of God, whatever that means. But yeah, certainly they're, or I could say it another way, they're, to be connected to the divine at all, you have to have these 7 qualities. You have to follow these 7 instructions and way of living. Are we saying the same thing, Ross?
I believe so. And just to help further clarify, we're talking about the Elohim aspect. I mean, we know that there is the Tetragrammaton aspect, and then there's the Elohim aspect. And at this level, we're talking about a reflection of the Elohim.
That's why it's called Selam Elohim.
Yes.
Very, very good point. Very, very good point. Okay, I don't want to get too much far afield, but point well taken. Next paragraph. When Adam left the Garden of Eden and entered the outside world, he became a ger, by virtue of his living in a land not his own. His home was the Garden of Eden, but now he had to brave it in a strange new place. He had to face the unknown. This made him a ger. The first man was the first ger. Very interesting. Very, very interesting. Again, I think it's giving a kind of a support, a kind of a chizuk to the, Benoach community, in that, again, the kind of maybe a feeling that people may have of estrangement, being a little foreign, joining something late in life, whatever you want to call it, is Adam was that way too. That's what he's pointing out. So it's something that is normal and part of a person's spiritual adventure, Okay. Okay, let's try to finish to the end of the page. As a ger, Adam could strive to return to the Garden of Eden, or he could strive to transform the outside world into a new Garden of Eden and bring the creation to perfection. Kabbalists say that it was God's plan to leave the world incomplete so that man, ground of creation, could complete it. So in other words, he's implying that the idea was the second one, that Adam should turn the rest of the world into a Garden of Eden. Next paragraph. God sent a scroll by the hand of the angel Raziel to Adam. The scroll is known as Sefer Raziel. It was the first book. Sefer Raziel still exists, but people are warned not to learn it because it contains printer's errors and forgeries that have crept into the text over time. It also contains formulae for summoning and commanding angels, a practice which is strictly forbidden. Despite this, Sefer Raziel is considered a kosher holy book, and many religious Jews keep a copy on their bookshelf and believe that it brings special holiness to the home. I happen to be one of those people. I happen to have a copy of this book. It's known about Borough Park. I started doing it during my first marriage, that there's a belief that this book helps protect your home from fires. I don't know where that came from. Not sure. But anyway, I have it in the house. You can get it in a small pocket version. I've never read it. As he says, you don't read it, you just have it. And anyway, so I'm familiar with this book. But there's a lot of stories also that the carrying around the Tanya is obviously a Torah, but they talk about the Tanya being also protective, having a protective quality. Okay. Unlike the laws of the Torah, which are meant for everyone, the mystical teachings are given only to souls worthy of receiving them. People who shun the Kabbalah are in reality being shunned by the Kabbalah. Oh, wow, that's a pretty powerful statement. Sefer Raziel begins with Adam's prayer after he had been ejected from the Garden of Eden. Okay, I think we're going to continue that part next time. Let's go on to the halacha part.
Just really quick.
Oh,
Sefer Raziel, you see that?
Yeah.
Rearrange the letters and it becomes the Arizal.
Wow, that's interesting. That's interesting. Yeah. Okay. Let's find the place we're up to here. So if I can find the place. I think we're up to paragraph 22 on page 105. Okay. There's a little note in parentheses on page 104. I'm going to start with that note. The goal of justice is to function as impartially and righteously as possible to the ultimate degree. The following section delineates some of the details of the standards of the Jewish Beit Din, the ecclesiastical court. Noahide courts are not obligated to follow these rules, but must be acquainted with them as points of reference. So in other words, he's not obligatory, but they're advisory. I guess that's probably until the end of the chapter, at least until part 2. Okay, here we go. Paragraph 22 on page 105. 2 litigants appear before a judge. One is dressed very elegantly with expensive clothing, and the other is wearing the clothes of a pauper. The judge should tell the elegantly dressed one, you should clothe the other one until he is dressed as elegantly as you are, or you should clothe yourself to appear as he does, and then you can enter judgment with him. So in other words, again, I think it has to do with what we discussed before, the issue of potential subtle biases. And what the judge is saying, that the two of you should be such a stark contrast in dress is not acceptable. Whether it's going to affect the judge or whether that's going to affect the morale of the pauper is a little unclear, but nevertheless, it causes an inequity, inequality between the two of them, and which has to be corrected. 23. The litigants should both sit or stand. It is improper for one to stand and the other to sit. The judge wishes to seat them both, he may do so. If they sit, they should sit side by side, neither one higher than the other, and they may so sit during the entire time that the judge is listening to the case. But when the judge's decision is being announced, then both litigants should be standing. The decision is the judge's announcement finding for the defendant and against the plaintiff, or for the plaintiff and against the defendant. Witnesses for either side should always stand during testimony. So again, the idea is that the 2 litigants should appear as much as possible as equal. One shouldn't stand and one sit. It just, again, it creates some kind of unequal footing in the courtroom to some extent or another, and that's not to be allowed. You know, I can tell you, I haven't done a lot of trials, but I've done a handful, and very subtle things make a difference in a trial. In a certain sense, unfortunately, it seems to me sometimes that when you litigate in the secular law by writing, it's more fair. Because when you write, you're just getting across your ideas. There's no charm involved. There's no, how the person holds himself. I mean, all these superficial things that people are touched by are absent, and they really have nothing to do with anything. But if you just write, then all you really have, the judge can see, is the substance. They can just read the arguments. Yeah, I mean, some people could write a little better than someone else. This is true, but I don't think it has the same effect as if one person's, whether they're more handsome or they just appear more confident and, have a better orating skills. I mean, none of that really has anything to do with whether, what the judgment in the case should be. So it kind of causes problems. I mean, in my mind, it kind of causes problems. And the judge, and what we're telling you is that in the Jewish court, the judge has to try to control those situations and make sure that they're on even footing as much as possible. So if you're talking about it in terms of dressing, it would appear to me that the same would be true in other things as well, in terms of, their arguments, or I don't know, just whatever it is, the judge is constantly looking, it seems, to try to keep them on an equal footing and to keep this completely about their arguments and their points they're making and their proof and evidence, and nothing, nothing superfluous to that. So, I mean, obviously juries, it's terrible. I mean, juries is it's a tough thing with juries, meaning to say, like, I understand why the American and the English system, has leaned towards jury trials, because there's a fear there'll be corruption among the people with power and so on and so forth. I understand that. But at the same time, there's problems. There's also equal problems with juries, in that, first of all, they're unskilled in analyzing law or making such decisions. I mean, they're not used to doing such things. They also are they don't have any responsibility. They come once, They're unknowns. They make their decision. They leave. There's no accountability about what they've done. And sometimes you can get people that just want to get out of there, or sometimes you get people that want to get back at certain type of person because now they can and nobody will know. And the person, in the litigant is just like their boss or just like their landlord or just like, and instead of, and so those things, it's very hard to know why they're making the decision. And there's very little recourse as far as, what, and that's an issue. Like with a judge, if the decision is horrible, first of all, it's going to get written down and you can appeal it. And the higher judge can kind of embarrass the lower judge by reversing their decision. That's for one thing, but juries, I don't know, they kind of, they make their decision and then they pack their bags and they're out of there. Anyway, so I guess one of my points is that I think that having a system of judges is not a bad system. We have to make sure we have the right judges, and obviously, there needs to be some kind of checks on judges also. And in the Sanhedrin system, there were higher courts and higher courts. A person could go to higher court. I don't know. I'm not sure about a Jewish appeal system, if there was one, how that worked. But anyway, okay, back to this. (24) If there are many cases before the judge, the case of an orphan should precede the case of a widow. The case of a widow should precede the case of a Torah scholar. The case of a scholar should precede the case of an unlearned man. The case of a woman should precede the case of a man, for a woman's embarrassment is greater. Interesting. So in other words, we learn a very interesting point here, that the two litigants in the case, the plaintiff and the defendant, they have to be on equal footing. They can't be treated differently. No preferential treatment. But in terms of the cases, there's preferential treatment for orphans, widows, Torah scholars, women, in terms of which case the judge is here first. So that's quite interesting. Okay. 25, it is forbidden for the judge to hear the plea of one of the litigants unless the other one is also present. Okay, so that's a very ancient thing, and you find that also in secular law as well. Trying to remember what it's called. I should know this, but slipped my mind at the moment. There's a Latin term for this. If you just talk to the judge and your adversary is not there, it's not something you're not supposed to do that. Not supposed to do it because you're not giving the other person a chance to rebut anything that you're saying. The judge is only hearing one side. It's called ex parte. Ex parte is outside the other part, the other party, the other interest is not present. That's an ex parte discussion. That's something that's not allowed. Okay. To listen to even one word of the case itself is forbidden, and we warn the litigant that he should not allow his words to be heard before the other litigant arrives. You have to warn him immediately not to say anything. 26. The judge may not hear testimony through an interpreter or a translator, as the truth is reached only by hearing the words of the litigants themselves. You must understand the language of the litigants and hear their testimony and proofs. If the judge does not speak their language fluently, he may use an interpreter to reply to the litigants to inform them of the judgment, the reason found for one and against that one. So basically, the judge has to understand the language of the litigants. He can't use an interpreter to listen. He can use an interpreter to communicate with them. And in terms of witnesses also, he has to understand the language of the witness himself. This isn't something that secular courts are careful about. They do use interpreters. The interpreter is supposed to swear that they're interpreting truthfully and accurately to the best of their ability, and then their testimony is accepted. So it's kind of testimony of testimony. But according to halacha, we don't do that. Okay. Next page, 106, paragraph 27. The judge must hear the arguments of the litigants, then review the arguments in their presence to be sure that he understands them clearly. Then he righteously decides the case in his heart, and afterward he reaches the final decision. Interesting. So they have to repeat their arguments. He has to make sure he understands. And then he thinks it through in his mind. I think what he means in his heart, meaning to say quietly in your mind, thinking it through. And then a final decision, I guess, is rendered verbally, or maybe in writing as well, as to what the decision is. He's supposed to take his time. He's supposed to go slowly and think it through as carefully as he needs to, not jump to make a decision. Okay. Paragraph 29. Paragraph 28. The judge should not defend the words of the litigant, but he should sit silently as each litigant says what he feels he must. And the judge should not instruct either of the litigants in his presentation of any argument. So obviously, this should be obvious from what we mentioned earlier. If one litigant can't stand higher than the other or dress nicer than the other, obviously the judge can't help out the arguments of any of the litigants or get involved. Okay, so that means even if he agrees with that particular litigant's argument or believes he has a valid argument, but let's say he's not bringing it out, he's not expressing it properly, the judge can't assist him, even if he's not articulating himself properly. Okay.
Does that mean that he can't ask a question for his own clarification?
No, I don't think that it means that. It means he can't make the argument himself or coach the person, meaning say, do you mean this? Do you mean that? He can ask. That's kind of what you're saying, but you can't do that. You can't, because that would be assisting them and leading them along.
Leading the witness, yes.
That he can't do that. So that's the problem. If he were to say, well, are you making such and such argument? And then the person could just say yes or no. That would be assisting too much. Because then if the person is confused or didn't mean that argument, he could play along and say, oh, I guess that's the good argument. And say, yes, that's what I meant, when really he didn't. And that's problematic. So he has to make sure. So he could ask questions, but they'd have to be questions about facts or about explaining. He could say, can you please explain that better? Seems like it's quite tricky. The line between a question and assistance is a very thin line. So hard. That's a difficult. You have to be quite skilled. (29) If the judge sees a favorable point in the case of either of the litigants, the litigant does not know how to bring forth the point, or gets angry and confused to the point of being unable to state his case clearly, the judge may come to his aid slightly and put him on the right track to state the beginning of his case. Where the judge must be careful of how he does this so as to avoid instructing the litigant in how to present a meritorious case. For if the judge did this, he would be perverting justice. So you see, it's very, very complicated. You'd have to say it in a way where you just kind of nudge a little bit without giving it away. Without giving away the farm here. You got to just little bit, push him a little bit in case he's just getting confused or has trouble speaking or something, But, I can give an example of, let's say, the litigant speaks in a very awkward way, but nevertheless is understandable. And then the judge, it seems like in that case, could repeat what he's saying just in a more clear manner. If you understand it, but it's just awkwardly said, so you're not really telling him anything, but you're just expressing it to yourself, to the people around, the other people, maybe other judges who are present. There's 3 judges, right? So you just explain it, bring it out, but you're not really adding anything to what the person's saying. So that's one point. I think also, again, so you don't, the point is you don't want to fundamentally, make the arguments for them. You can clarify what it is if you know this is what they're already doing. I think that's what we're saying. You can help them communicate, but you can't craft arguments for them. You can't make claims for them. You can just help them express it properly. Big difference. "30. Prior to the judges hearing the case, if he feels personally threatened by either of the litigants, he may refuse to sit in judgment. But if he has already heard their words and knows which way the judgment is leaning, it is not proper for the judge to refuse to pass judgment out of fear of one of the litigants." This is very famous. This is a verse in the Torah. Not allowed to be afraid of making the right judgment, even if one of the people are a bully or strong or organized crime or whatever it is. He can't. But it's interesting how it depends. He can decline to hear the case because he doesn't want to get involved with dangerous people. But once he's started hearing the case, he has to render the decision. He's not permitted to be afraid. And obviously that also means if you're not permitted to be afraid, that Hashem will protect that person due to the fact that that's his obligation not to be afraid. I don't think Hashem gives a person an obligation not to be afraid and then checks out. In any event, okay, so that's very, very important, and that takes a lot of courage in many, many cases. Not easy. Okay, 31. There's more than one judge in a case. It is forbidden for any of them to say after the trial, "I judged and you're married, but my colleagues found against you, and as much as they were the majority, what could I do?" So you're not allowed to say that. Interesting. So a person is not allowed to admit that he was the dissenter. It's quite interesting. Obviously, in the secular courts, particularly in appellate courts where you have multiple judges, famously there's something called the dissent. The judge disagrees. He writes his own opinion, telling us, why he disagrees with the majority of the court. But evidently, we're saying that in Jewish law, that's not something that should be done. I guess it causes conflict for the litigant who's maybe bitter about the decision, and he feels, there was someone who agreed with me, that may cause him not to be at peace with the decision. It also is that this particular judge is pointing the finger at the other two. He's kind of saying, don't blame me. If you want to take revenge, I'm on your side. And that's also obviously poor conduct. Okay. A judge is forbidden to sit in judgment with a colleague whom he knows to be a thief or a wicked person. So a judge can't sit in judgment with another person, with another judge who's a wicked judge, who's a thief or wicked in some ways, a transgressor. He must not sit in judgment with another until he knows with whom he is sitting. No one should sign a contract until he knows with whom he is signing. All right. That's a little bit of an edge. Don't sign agreements unless you know the person you're signing with is trustworthy. Good advice. Don't sign at the dotted line. Okay, 33. A judge is forbidden to judge someone he loves, even though it is less than a great abiding love. Nor can he judge one he hates, even though the person is not his enemy. Ideally, the litigant should be equal in his eyes and the heart, and in the eyes and the heart of the judge. If he recognizes neither of them nor their deeds, he can render the most honest judgment possible. Obviously, this is something that we do find to a certain extent in secular law, this idea of recusal. If their judge has something of interest, what they call a conflict of interest, in judging the case where he sides with one litigant against the other for some reason, and And even if there isn't a conflict of interest, but he has a relationship, a judge can recuse themselves because, he owns stock in the company that's being sued, or even not, even if it just has a close relationship, and he could. They usually don't do that, though. The truth is that, as I've said in the past, from my experience in court, judges get to know the lawyers, and they don't get to know the parties, the litigants, but they do get to know the lawyers, and they may like one lawyer better than the other lawyer. So that, or one lawyer they know for many years, and the other guy's new on the block, and they don't know who that person at all. I wonder if that's, according to Jewish law, problematic, because they clearly like one of the people. As I told you, the story is like, you come to court and the judge's like, "Hey, nice to see you," to one of the lawyers, and the other one doesn't say hello. It's kind of a lousy way to get your day going. Anyway, so this is the point, to try to keep things as equal as possible, and not to weaken the morale, and also to make sure that that the judge's mind is really clear and really being objective. Okay. Looks like we have time for one. I'll read one more and then I'm going to stop. 34. Men of learning who are contemptuous of each other should not judge a case together. So two men of scholars who don't like each other, they shouldn't judge a case. The judgment is likely to be distorted, as a contempt would incline one to contradict the opinions of the other. Yeah, person is basically, he's contrary because he doesn't like the person, and that's problematic. Okay, so it's a lot of practical things we're studying. Now, obviously, these laws are really, really important, and I think we're seeing it today. It's interesting. We're seeing it in the news to a certain extent. Certainly, I don't want to get too political, but there is the element of different views, different opinions about respect for the laws of the country in different ways, and different people side on different sides of it, what laws they respect more or not. But the point is that for the court to have legitimacy is very, very important, and for us to have a court system that we can rely upon to make sure that there are no injustices, and that people who need help, that there's a courts that they can get help from. It's very, very important. Because otherwise, Judaism becomes religions like other religions. They're in a church, they're separated from the world, they don't change the world, they just are about serving God in some temple somewhere while the world goes crazy. That's not what that's not what Judaism is about. It's actually what? Bringing God here and using those values that we get from being more spiritual to make this a better world.